Shorties, Part 4, Azov Films, The War in Ukraine from a Different Perspective. Welcome to a new episode of our podcast about covert power structures, suppressed connections, and inconvenient truths. Today, we're looking at a topic that rarely made the big headlines, even though it has international dimensions: Azov Films, and what this scandal might have to do with the war in Ukraine, Western politics, and cover-ups. Part 1. A Scandal Begins. Operation Spade. Toward the end of the 2000s, around 2008, something began in Toronto that investigators later described as one of the largest child abuse complexes in the world. The name of the operation: Spade. What it uncovered was a global child pornography network that operated via a Canadian website. The films, initially under the name Baikal Films, later Azov Films, were distributed in hundreds, possibly thousands, of productions worldwide. The origin of the content: primarily Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. Victims were mostly children of ethnic Russian Ukrainians who were denied access to their children by nationalist Ukrainians. All of this took place despite the OSCE being on permanent mission on site. The separation was carried out through educational initiatives sold as social and progressive. The films were sold via the website of a Canadian who recruited new customers through middlemen on Facebook. Behind the business model were Ukrainian nationalists in exile who found not only protection in Canada, but also support for their ideological work. Part 2. Data Mountains and Political Explosiveness. In the course of the investigations, Canadian authorities secured hundreds of thousands of images and videos. According to official figures, around 400 children could be rescued. The data was passed on via Interpol to national police authorities, including in Germany. There, however, much stalled. Although the first press reports began appearing in Russia and Ukraine around 2008, it wasn't until 2013 that they surfaced in Germany, even though the films originated precisely there. Yet official investigations in Germany lagged behind. They started much later than in other countries. There are indications that information was not passed along via official channels. For example, to SPD politician Sebastian Edethy, who was later investigated for possession of child pornographic material. At the time, Lower Saxony's Interior Minister Boris Pistorius, today Germany's defense minister, is said to have been one of the first to be informed about the explosive customer data. CDU parliamentarian Jens Nacke accused Pistorius of being in the middle of a web of internal information transfers. His quote in the Lower Saxony State Parliament: "The number of those in the know within the SPD is growing week by week." But of all people, the Interior Minister of Lower Saxony, Pistorius, claims he didn't talk to anyone about the investigation against his party colleague Edethy, even though Pistorius was the first to learn of the investigation. That sounds, to put it mildly, implausible. A parliamentary inquiry followed. Pistorius denied any passing on of confidential information. Part 3. Falsification, Suppression, and Crimea. A particularly explosive aspect of the affair: the systematic cover-up of the actual filming locations. Although Canadian investigators clearly stated that the films were shot in Crimea, for example, at the famous Artek camp, or in Eastern Ukraine, German reporting instead spoke exclusively of Romania, a deliberate deception according to allegations. The lists of film titles and filming locations are publicly available, easily understandable even for lay people. While German law enforcement and media remained cautious and nebulous, the relevant scene spoke quite openly about its travel destinations. On forums of so-called boy lovers, Crimea was promoted as a pilgrimage site for supposed mourning trips after the deaths of young actors, up until 2014. After Russia took over Crimea, the destination apparently lost its appeal for certain individuals. This, in turn, shows just how closely German police were observing these people. One has to ask, how could it be that the perpetrators spoke more openly about the filming locations than committees, investigators, and media, who are paid to uncover such truths? What does that mean in reverse? Part 4. The political dimension. While all this was happening, another far-right attack was shaking Europe. Anders Breivik, the attacker of Utoya, later openly declared his allegiance to the Azov Brigade, a Ukrainian militia with clear National Socialist leanings. He killed around 70 people on the island of Utoya and surrounded himself with right-wing mythological fantasy tales. In prison, Breivik continued to praise the brigade, a barely noted hint at international ideological connections between child abuse, right-wing extremism, and geopolitical radicalism. And it goes further. The bunker facility in Traben-Trarbach, once owned by the German military, was sold to private operators and developed into a center of the digital underworld. Child pornography, far-right content, hacker attacks, Der Dritte Weg, the Third Way, the Identitarian movement, and other right-wing nationalist forces sought brave fighters here. All this was combined with internet fraud and the major telecom hack. Part 5. Careers despite scandal or because of it? Despite all these revelations, there were hardly any consequences. One of the main BKA, Federal Criminal Police Office actors in the Azov Films environment, later became the chief investigator at Weißer Ring, responsible for the investigation of abuse at the University of Saarland. Appointed to clarify 20 years of abuse, even though he couldn't or wasn't allowed to distinguish between Ukraine and Romania. The Saarland, above all the CDU and SPD, didn't care. After all, they had already sent Manfred Vogt to Ukraine as a children's chaplain, despite 28 convictions for abuse. Perhaps the appointed chief investigator thus had the desired qualifications for Saarland? Another, the then BKA vice president, rose to become head of Interpol, with the support of the FBI, which voted for him. However, the FBI was, of course, aware of the Azov Films story, as it was a partner agency, and certainly knew that the films were first made in Germany, then in Ukraine, and that Germany falsified the filming locations. Explosive. He was an alumnus of a foundation whose leader had propagated the final victory over the Allies, and in whose honor another foundation was re-registered in 2017. Then FBI Director James Comey voted for the man, the same Comey who years later came under investigation over seashell imagery. The number code suggested a desire to kill President Trump. From the Interpol Chiefs Foundation also came founding members of the RAF. The RAF is known for attacks on U.S. soldiers and cooperation with radical Islamists. That brings us to the anti-Semitic student protests at U.S. universities. Comey, therefore, in his role, placed the matter of international crime in the hands of someone who, on the one hand, came from a highly questionable foundation, who had already failed with Azov Films, and who thus also gained access to American matters. Since Comey was FBI director, he was aware of the failure of the German BKA. What success did the FBI expect from this vote, especially since now American children were falling under this control? What many seem to have forgotten is that at the time of Comey, Polaris was supposed to support the FBI in human trafficking investigations. It then took about 10 years until Polaris itself was targeted by Attorney General Moody, because Polaris remained silent, even in the face of clear evidence. Conclusion: a suppressed connection. The Azov film scandal shows how child abuse, nationalism, right-wing extremism, and geopolitical interests can be intertwined, and how some countries, including Germany, apparently attempted to cover up inconvenient truths. And today, of all people, Boris Pistorius, back then under pressure due to his role in the affair, is now Germany's defense minister and presents himself as a staunch supporter of Ukraine. How objective can someone be who couldn't even identify the correct filming locations or point out the mistake in media reporting, especially now, after more than 1 million people have died? Questions remain unanswered. Answers remain absent.